In the quiet corners of a forgotten attic, a sinister presence stirs. Meet a young man unwittingly drawn into a chilling encounter with a cursed doll. As he delves deeper into its mysteries, he finds himself in its malevolent grasp. Meanwhile, his mother watches in helpless terror, knowing the dark truth behind the doll's haunting power. Brace yourself for a tale where fear takes on a tangible form, where every shadow hides a secret, and where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Welcome to Trapped by the Cursed Doll. Sometimes, I feel like I was destined to be the bad kid. My dad walked out on my mom and I before I could walk, and I remember being angry and confused about it since the moment I could form a thought. To make things worse, my parents decided to name me Jordan, which is maybe the most skinhead-sounding name you can have. All of this is to say that I was a serious piece of shit kid. I started stealing my mom's cigarettes at 11. I had my first fight at 12, and I probably would have been arrested at 13 if I didn't pin that break-in on my buddy. Mom put up with me the best she could. Her solution? Moving from our little apartment all the way to a decrepit crypt just outside of the city. The house had 3 bedrooms, creaking wooden floors, and was way out of Mom's price range. But thankfully, that didn't matter, because she had just inherited the place. The house belonged to my grandmother, who I must have met maybe once or twice as a little kid. Mom thought that taking me from one small town to another would be a fresh start. Truth be told, I didn't really care. One of the bedrooms was still full of all of Grandma's dumb pretties, her name for the collection of things she gathered in her 80-something years of life. There were a lot of clocks, none of which ran anymore, a folded flag, and a bunch of little porcelain babies. But above all else, there were dolls. Little, ugly, sackcloth dolls with dead painted expressions. It was all weird, but nothing really surprised me. That is, until I got to the back of the room. I almost hadn't noticed it, but tucked away in a back corner, sitting under a dust-filled beam of light, was a white sheet, draped over what I assumed was a chair. My first thought here was what could be so valuable that it was the only thing in the room worth protecting from all the dust. I didn't even care what it was, but knowing it was worth something to someone once was enough to pique my curiosity. And without hesitation, I pulled the sheet off. It was another doll. This doll, however, was different from all the rest. It was a woman and would be as tall as one if it stood up, probably standing at least 5'4", or maybe taller. Her body was built more like a puppet than a doll, with ball joints at the wrists and elbows and shoulders, anywhere a person's arms or legs would bend. The doll's silhouette was almost perfect, if not for her arms and legs feeling a bit too long and lanky, and the paint that would be her skin was starting to chip and peel to reveal the wood beneath. That is, everywhere except for her face. My God, her face. I still have trouble describing it now. It was perfect, made of porcelain or something like that, much finer than the wood. If you weren't looking close enough, you'd swear it was the face of a real girl. A young black woman, to be precise, probably my age or a bit older, with long, curly, real hair falling over her face. That face was flawless, not like the rest of its body, with not even a chip in the paint to break the illusion. I remember reaching my hand out to touch it, but stopping, completely wigged out by the thing. She didn't even have minor imperfections you might find on an actual person's face. She looked like one of those Renaissance statues, unbelievably lifelike to the point of being better than reality. Her cheekbones were perfectly carved or molded onto whatever material the face was made of. Her nose had little nostrils, and her lips even parted ever so slightly into what was almost a smirk. The only thing that broke the illusion were her striking, golden glass eyes, which stared perfectly forward, lacking in that look of life real people had. My trance was interrupted by the sound of my mom entering the room behind me. She saw what I had found, and her face instantly broke into a pout. Her eyes were immediately trained on the doll, and I quickly moved my hand away from it. "What is this thing?" I asked. I didn't have to specify what. "Her name is Linda," Mom responded. She had a scolding kind of tone, probably hoping I would show more respect to my late grandmother's things. "Your grandmother bought her at a carnival in France when she was about your age. She said she was made by some famous doll maker, and that she had always wanted one of his dolls ever since she was a little girl." "Neat," I said, a bit disinterested now that I had more context. "Yeah, your father always liked her too." It was my turn to pout now. Mom had broken the no dad talk rule, and then had simply walked out of the room with nothing more than a dinner's at 8. I looked back at the doll. I was now convinced she was nothing more than just that. Some fancy doll bought from a creepy doll maker in France, the homeland of creepy weirdos. My frown deepened a bit as I realized exactly what I was thinking. Did I believe she was more than that? It was almost a month later before I thought about Linda again. I had spent the night drinking with a couple of guys and this girl Veronica from my class. I was quite drunk, and as I stumbled towards the house, I remember my leg getting caught in some tall weed, which was strong enough to wrap around my ankle and stop me for a second. As I knelt to tug myself free, I noticed a weird white patch in the middle of the yard, reflecting the moonlight. I ran my fingers over it and realized it was concrete, a rectangle foundation about 4 feet long, with an uneven surface. I figured there must have been a shed there at some point, got my leg free, and went inside. I climbed through the kitchen window and up the staircase towards my bedroom. When I got to my room, I went straight to bed, not even taking my shoes off. It wasn't long before I started getting this weird feeling, like I was being watched by someone else in the room. I glanced around, and even though it was dark, I was pretty sure nobody was there. I would have seen them, right? Some silhouette of a person, or I would have heard them breathing or moving or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, and found myself glancing at a corner of the room just by my dresser. Even when I fell asleep, I would wake up several more times in the night and look back over at that same spot, sure that someone was there watching me. The next morning, I knew why when I saw Linda slumped over in a chair in that very same corner of my room. I marched through the hallway, now tightly packed with boxes of Grandma's doodads, straight to Mom, and asked her why that creepy doll was in my room. She rolled her eyes. I need space in that bedroom for my home office, and it sure as hell isn't going in my room or out in the living room to creep out guests. I didn't listen and dragged the doll out into the hallway before going right back to sleep. When I woke up later, she was back in my room, so I dragged her back out again. This cycle repeated for a few days, until eventually I just had to live with the fact that I was always going to wake up to that doll staring at me. I sat there one morning, just staring into her cold, motionless eyes. They were so shiny and perfect, even after all this time, that I could see my own reflection in them. Grandma's weird-ass doll was becoming more than a creepy, unwanted presence in my life. She was becoming an intrusive mockery of my defiance. That night, I decided to get rid of her. I grabbed the doll's arm and dragged her out into the living room. I wasn't just getting rid of the problem. Now, I was making a point to Mom. I laid the doll's head against the bricks of the fireplace and stomped my boot down on her jaw. Instantly, I felt strange, watching that perfect, lifelike face shatter like glass. My dramatic execution felt, for a moment, like it had a real victim. But then, seeing the portions of her human face split into uneven pieces was like an uncanny reminder of just how good this inanimate thing was at mimicking life. I know now that in that moment, her little glass eye was staring back up at me. I left the shattered doll and went to sleep. When I woke up, she was back in her chair, as intact as the day I found her. I was quiet at breakfast that morning. I remember I couldn't touch my food and couldn't bring myself to make eye contact with my mother. I didn't say a word when she said, "I'm glad you stopped being stubborn about that doll. I would have thought a boy your age would be thrilled to have a girl in his room." She laughed. I didn't tell her about Linda. I never believed in the supernatural, but I immediately knew something was wrong with that doll. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was scared, and I was afraid of what might happen if I went to my mom about the doll. Not that she would even believe me. I made it a rule not to bother Linda. I wouldn't even touch the doll again, which also made my room a place of never-ending tension. I hated when I had to go in there and started to sleep on the couch in the living room or at a friend's house. When eventually I had no choice but to sleep in my own bed again, I would spend hours every night lying awake, staring at the doll, knowing that the moment I looked away, she would get her revenge. Time went on, and the revenge never came. Slowly, I stopped being afraid of Linda, but I still stared at her. It became less of a defense mechanism and more admiration. I admired the doll for her beauty, how still and perfect her face was, how striking her yellow eyes were behind the sheen of glass. After some time, Linda was becoming all I could think about. I'd drift off during class, thinking about her eyes. I'd call girls by her name by complete accident. I even became less of a troublemaker because all I wanted to do at the end of the day was come home and stare at the doll. It wasn't long before I was talking to her, telling her about my day, and even sitting her next to me on the bed as I did so. My head was always clearer around Linda. She never spoke back, but I could swear she understood everything I was saying. Like she understood me, in a way no friend or girl ever had. She didn't need to say anything to prove it. At the same time, I was starting to have nightmares. I dreamt about nails in the floorboards. I dreamt visions of my staircase, growing longer and steeper and darker as I stared at it. I dreamt about a malevolent, faceless being pressing its ear up against my door, a shadow in the backyard beneath the moonlight, and a woman standing at the top of a staircase, staring down at me. The dreams were always obscure, with an ominous feeling about the unclear images I saw in them. This didn't stop me from waking up in a panic, sweat on my forehead, and clutching my chest like I might have a heart attack right then and there. Then I'd look over at Linda, and everything would be okay. The panic would stop. I'd catch my breath, and I'd be able to fall back asleep, knowing that she was watching me sleep. It didn't get by me that my closeness to Linda was making Mom uncomfortable. Occasionally, she would hear me talking through the door and come in expecting to see a friend or a girl, and instead see Linda laying limp as ever in her chair. She always looked at the doll with fear, kind of like I looked at her before Linda and I had started to get along. The look would only get worse when she glanced back at me, the kind of look I'm sure plenty of people get from their families before being locked up in an asylum or something. It's probably for this reason that Mom sent me to live with my great uncle, just under a year after we had moved into the new house. She gave plenty of reasons. Great uncle was coming down with Alzheimer's and needed someone to take care of him. I was hanging out with the wrong crowd, which was why we left in the first place. She even let her true colors show a bit the night before I left, snapping, "You're too damn old to be talking to dolls," before hiding her head in her hands and quietly sobbing at the dinner table. I didn't fight it. I had no reason to stay, though I kept thinking to myself what a shame it would be to leave Linda behind. I spent a few years with my uncle, and for the most part, they were uneventful. His Alzheimer's was easy to deal with, at least for a while, and by this point, I had calmed down. Linda did that to me, and even though she wasn't here, I could remember her calming presence whenever I found myself getting angry. I found myself missing her, the way someone might miss an old friend with whom they left things unsaid. It was weird, I knew it, but I knew that Linda was more than just a doll, so it didn't bother me. In the autumn, I'd look up at the golden moon and smile. It reminded me so much of her eyes. At some point, Uncle asked me if I had any girls in my life. Without thinking, I blurted out Linda's name. "Linda?" my uncle repeated, and I was immediately embarrassed. I shook my head and was going to explain it away when he said something that caught me by surprise. "I thought she wasn't around anymore," he said, and ended the conversation. Eventually, Uncle Alzheimer's became too much for me to handle on my own, and we had to move him into a home. I was 18, didn't have a job, and had no real choice but to move back in with my mom. Mom and I hadn't kept up much since I left, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I came back home. The house was dirty and uncared for, even more than when we had first moved in. Mom had developed a drinking problem while I was gone, the evidence of which was littered all around the house. It was a conscious sort of mess, with empty bottles stacked neatly in corners or on countertops. Cared for, just enough not to leave them lying about, but not enough to throw them in the garbage. Despite this, or maybe because of it, Mom seemed happy to have me back. She hugged me tight at the door and welcomed me home. She asked if I wanted anything to eat, even though the kitchen end was clearly in no shape to cook anything in. I was half lying, and she could tell. She told me the hallway was kind of a mess. If I didn't want to deal with cleaning it up, I could just sleep on the couch or on her bed even, and she'd sleep in the living room. I told her to stop being ridiculous and broke away from her hug. Despite her clear reluctance to let go, I climbed up the stairs, very nearly stepping on an exposed nail at the top step, and turned down the hall to my room. It was packed with boxes, clothes, rolled up carpet, and even furniture. It looked less like the lazy storage solution Mom would have me believe it to be, and more like a barricade. I picked through the stuff easily and approached the door to my old bedroom, only to find myself frozen in place. My hand on the doorknob trembled. I found myself wondering, what if she wasn't in there? What if she was? Which would be worse? I felt riddled with anxiety, thinking of all the things I would have to say and how I would say them. I was worried that Linda wouldn't understand, wouldn't forgive me. I felt like she would ask where I was all those years, and I wouldn't know how to answer. I swallowed my nerve and opened the door, and there she was, sitting in the corner like she always had, motionless, without a sound, perfect in her stillness. I sat on the bed across from her and held her hand. It was the same painted wood it always had been, but to me, it felt warm, familiar. Linda was still here, and I was back, and there was nothing that needed to be explained. We were back together, and that was all that mattered. The nightmares started again that night. Nails in the floor. Something dark. Something terrible trying to get into my room. A girl in the backyard staring up at my window, illuminated by the amber moonlight. The next year or so was rough. Mom and I would break into constant arguments, with almost anything triggering a shouting match. I was tracking mud in the house. I was staying up too late. I was apparently stealing her booze right out from under her nose. Anything would start the argument, but I felt deep down it was always related to the same thing, Linda. She seemed to hate her, and it drove her crazy how close we were. It became clear to me that the 2 years Mom had spent alone in the house with the doll had taken their toll. She wasn't the same person I grew up with. She was always angry or paranoid, and I would often come home to see her sobbing at the kitchen table. She lost her job, was behind on the mortgage, and almost never allowed herself upstairs. I often wondered what sweet Linda could be doing to make her so upset. I started to question if the scratches in the furniture and the broken objects littered around the house were my mom's doing, after all. I remember needing to get out one night. I ended up going to a party, invited by the friends I made when I was still in school. It was a mediocre get-together, but exactly the break from Mom's manic crazy that I needed. Veronica was there, and to my surprise, still into me. I chatted her up, and when she flirted with me, I flirted back. But the whole time, my mind was on Linda. After a haze of drinks, I was back in my bedroom, and I was so sure I brought Veronica there. I was staring at my feet at the edge of the bed and was going to turn around and tell her that I just couldn't get it up, when to my surprise, I was met with the sight of amber eyes. It was Linda, laid out on my bed. I knew I hadn't put her there, but here she was, and there Veronica wasn't. I climbed over to her. I reached out to touch her hand and gasped. It didn't feel like wood. It felt like skin, the most perfect, soft, womanly skin I had ever felt. As I looked up her arm, I could see that it was free of the blemishes and chipped paint from before. It was as if a real woman was in my bed, only motionless, and yet I still felt her inviting me forward, asking me to continue without a voice. I looked into Linda's eyes, and she looked back. I cupped her cheek and kissed her, and her lips were the most perfect lips I have ever felt. I knew in that moment what I had felt for so long. I was in love with Linda, and I didn't care how strange it felt. I knew she loved me back. "I love you," I spoke, more of a moan than a whisper. I felt darkness looming at my door, and at the sound of my words, it flew open. Mom stood there in the doorframe, tears staining her face, a bottle in her hand. She screamed at me, asking what I was doing, both of us knowing it was a rhetorical question. I pulled myself off Linda and sat up straight at the foot of the bed, embarrassed, but still not letting go of her hand. Mom screamed and sobbed. "Look at you," she said, "in bed with that fucking whore." I was confused, but I was also angry. I stood up and told her to take it back. I shouted at her, shouted that Linda was not a whore, that she had no right to speak to her like that. In response, Mom pushed past me and chucked the bottle at Linda's head. I was seeing red now, and I shoved her out of the room and into the hallway. She stumbled a bit, and I was brought back to the reality of the situation a little when I saw her almost tip over. I never once thought I could lay hands on my mother like that. It had never once crossed my mind, never felt possible. And here, I had almost pushed her over. I cursed under my breath and slammed the door. I tried to walk right out the front door, down the street, anywhere I could get away from my mother and get my head straight. But she caught me on the stairwell. "Please, don't go," she stammered, tears running down her face and choking her words. "Don't leave me alone here with her, not now, not after that." I tried to get her off me, but she latched onto me like her life depended on it. I tried to tell her to calm down, that nothing was going to happen. I said I needed to go, but she just kept shaking her head, sobbing, screaming that she was going to kill her. I shouted at her that it was just one of Grandma's dolls and nothing else, something I didn't even believe. How could a doll ever hurt her? I asked. "Because my mother never bought that doll," she said with a crying voice. She fell quiet for a minute, choking on her own tears, before continuing, trying to be clearer before her panicked, frantic sobbing. "Linda was your grandmother's maid. That little French whore was always flirting with your father, always giving in to his advances." I was immediately stunned by the mention of my dad, and she could see the expression on my face change. Her tone became more frantic, more defensive. "I was 16 and pregnant. Oh, and he was going to leave me for her, that little slut. So I pushed her down the stairs." She shut her eyes, probably unable to stand the judgment and the shock in my gaze. I pushed her down the stairs, then I buried her with Daddy's cement out back. It was like she was reverting to that little girl as she spoke. She opened her eyes, which were red from the strain and crying, and shouted in my face, "I killed her, and now she's going to kill me. You can't leave, Jordan. You can't let her kill me." I was shocked. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and she just kept shaking me, rocking me back and forth as she tugged on my shirt. I whispered for her to stop. Then I said it outright. Then I shouted it and shoved her when she didn't let go. Her grip on my shirt slipped, and she stumbled backward, stepping onto the exposed nail at the top of the staircase. She shrieked in pain and tumbled backward, the nail tearing through her foot as she collapsed down the flight of stairs. I was frozen in shock, watching as she hit every stair on her way to the bottom. I had to catch my breath before I followed her down, slowly ascending every step, careful not to step on the smeared blood and shifting all my weight on the banister, feeling like I might collapse myself. Mom was laying on the floor at the foot of the staircase, a twisted mess of a person. A hole was torn from the center of her foot, outward through her toes. Her neck was crooked, bone jutting out where it bent at an impossible angle. Her right arm was beneath her body, her left one bent backward, and her legs folded. She lay there still, looking like a discarded doll, and if not for her wheezing, could have well played the part. "Please," she whined, staring up at me through the tears and blood in her eyes. I clutched my mouth. I was staring at my mother, broken in a way no boy should ever have to see a parent. I was also looking at a murderer, a killer who had just confessed to ending an innocent life out of jealousy. Not just any life either. My Linda, who had once lived, only to be robbed from life too early by the woman on the floor in front of me. I looked back and saw Linda. She was sitting at the top of the staircase, her head leaning against the banister. I looked at her amber eyes, and for once swore I could see something in them. Real emotion, delight. One look in her eyes, and I knew what I had to do. I looked back down at the crippled creature on the floor below me. All pity and fear had left me, and I raised my leg and broke my boot down on her jaw. I dragged my mom's body out the door and stuffed it into the trunk of her Cadillac and let it drift on neutral into a local river. As I watched it sink beneath the inky murk, I remember looking up at the sky, finding it remarkable just how yellow the moon was that night. When I got home, the blood trail leading down the staircase and out the door was completely gone. As I walked up the stairs, I noticed that even the nail jutting out of the top step was missing. The door to my room was open, and there lay Linda, waiting for me. I held her to my chest and slept dreamlessly through the night. The next day, I told the cops what my mom told me. I said she confessed to the murder of a girl about 19 years ago, just before running off with some guys she met at a bar in town. They had their questions, of course, but the forensics on the body dug up in my backyard showed that I would have to be a murderous baby if I was responsible. Mom apparently made a reputation for herself as a drunk while I was away, and with no signs of struggle, the cops had no trouble believing my story. I sold the house to a family friend who reached out not long after Mom went missing, and I hear from him every now and then. Linda and I are living in a one-bedroom apartment now. I think she likes the beach. I'm hoping we can move to France someday, somewhere with a beach. I don't regret what I did. Even if I wish my mother was still the person she was before we moved into that house, I know that all of that was a lie. She was a killer the whole time. Anyone who would rob the world of an angel like Linda deserved what they had coming. I recently got a call from the guy who bought that old house. He usually calls me every other week, sometimes to check in, ask if I heard from my mom. This time was different though. After his usual small talk, he asked me about the doll I left among my mom's stuff. You know, the one that kind of looks like her. Except for the yellow eyes. I'm leaving now, before Mom's doll can get me like Linda got her. I'm never setting foot in that house again. I'm not scared though. Cautious, sure. But I have Linda here to protect me. We're together now, and nothing is going to tear us apart. As I'm writing this though, I keep glancing out my window. I can't help but feel anxious about how unseasonably yellow the moon is tonight.